The echo of the organ cut through the golden twilight of the cathedral like a knife. 1,500 gazes fell upon a small woman in a blue apron with weathered hands, who had just stood up among the marble pews. "Lies!" shouted Margaret Sullivan, with a voice that made the stained glass windows tremble. "That woman is not who she claims to be." Margaret didn't know. But the man at the altar, watching her with wide eyes, was the same one who had destroyed her life 15 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Sterling, radiant in her French silk dress, paled like the altar candle's wax. The guests, an elite in Italian suits and century-old jewels, turned their heads toward the intruder with expressions of horror and contempt. But the groom remained motionless, his gray eyes fixed on that humble woman holding crumpled papers in her trembling hands. His lips parted slightly, as if he had seen a ghost, as if time had turned back 15 years in a single second. Margaret didn't know yet. She didn't know that this tall, elegant man with silver hair and features refined by money was the same person who had left her alone, pregnant, and without explanation on a rainy night. She didn't know that her cry for justice had just opened a wound that would change their lives forever. Truth has a terrible way of finding its perfect moment, and what she was about to reveal would not only ruin the wedding, but rewrite the history of everyone present. If this story has already touched your heart in this first minute, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in human goodness again. What secret did Victoria Sterling hide? How had a simple cleaning lady come to know the truth that all of high society ignored? And above all, what would happen when Margaret discovered who the man standing at the altar really was? Margaret Sullivan was 38 years old and had the hands of a woman who had known only hard work. Every morning at 5 o'clock sharp, she would wake up in her small apartment in the South End, where the noise of buses and the smell of fried food mixed in an urban symphony she no longer heard. Her cracked mirror reflected back the image of a woman who had learned to be invisible. Brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, clean but worn clothes, brown eyes that had cried so much they now seemed eternally dry. She was the type of person people saw without looking, who existed in the margins of a world that functioned thanks to her silent work. The alarm clock read 5:15 when Margaret headed to the kitchen. Black coffee, no sugar because she couldn't afford it, and toast with margarine. Always the same routine, always the same economy of gestures and words. On the worn Formica table next to the lidless salt shaker rested a faded photograph. A little girl with enormous eyes and a toothless smile, hugging a younger woman who radiated hope. "Good morning, my love," Margaret whispered each morning, touching the glass with her fingertips. "Mommy's going to work." Emma had died at 3 years old. Pneumonia that became complicated because they had no health insurance, because Margaret worked off the books, because when she needed help most, she was completely alone. 12 years had passed since then, but the pain remained there, lodged in her chest like a stone she couldn't spit out or swallow. Alexander Bennett had disappeared one October night when Margaret was 4 months pregnant. Without a word, without a letter, without an explanation that could make sense of 15 years of shared life. One day he was there, talking to her about his dreams of opening a small business, and the next, his side of the bed was cold and his clothes had vanished from the closet. Margaret never knew why he left. Had it been the pregnancy? Fear of responsibility? Another woman? The questions had tortured her for years, until the exhaustion of being a single mother and the pain of losing Emma had buried them under a mountain of daily survival. At 6 in the morning, Margaret waited for the bus at the rusted stop on Central Avenue. Around her, other invisible workers, housekeepers, gardeners, security guards finishing their night shifts. People who kept the city running while the rich slept on Egyptian cotton sheets. Her destination that morning was different from usual. Instead of the office building where she had cleaned for 5 years, she was heading to the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, where she had been assigned extra work. A high society wedding that needed perfect cleaning before the ceremony. "It's the wedding of the year," her supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez had explained with that mixture of contempt and fascination that poor people feel for others' wealth. Victoria Sterling is marrying a very important businessman. Even city officials will be there. Margaret had nodded without interest. Rich people's weddings were all the same. Expensive flowers, dresses that cost more than her annual salary, and people who talked about love while calculating inheritances. She had known true love once, or at least had believed she knew it. Now she only knew work. The bus stopped in front of the cathedral with a sigh of worn brakes. Margaret got off carrying her blue plastic bucket and rags. The building rose before her like a gray stone mountain, with its Gothic towers disappearing into the low dawn clouds. There was something poetic about her situation, a broken woman cleaning the altar where others would celebrate the happiness that had been denied to her. But Margaret had learned that life wasn't poetic. It was simply hard, and all you could do was keep going, one day at a time, one clean surface after another. She didn't know that this morning, among the folds of red velvet and under the carved marble pews, she would find something that would change everything. She didn't know that her invisibility was about to become the most visible cry of her life. What secret did the city's most elegant cathedral hide? And why was Margaret, a simple cleaning lady, destined to discover it? The cathedral smelled of incense and white roses when Margaret pushed through the side door at 7 in the morning. Her steps echoed in the sacred silence, each footfall a small echo that got lost among the marble columns. Morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, creating rainbows of color that danced across the polished floor. She had never seen such a beautiful place prepared for a single ceremony. Thousands of imported roses formed white cascades from the altar to the entrance. Golden silk ribbons intertwined between the pews like rivers of liquid light. Every detail screamed money, power, perfection. Margaret began her work in silence. First, polish each pew until the wood shone like mirrors. Then, clean every inch of the marble floor, being careful not to touch the floral decorations. Her hands knew the ritual. Scrub, rinse, dry, repeat. At 9, the organizers began to arrive. Women in impeccable suits and heels that sounded like metronomes, shouting orders to an army of employees who ran back and forth adjusting microscopic details. Margaret made herself smaller, more invisible, moving among them like a useful ghost. "You, cleaning lady!" shouted a voice from the altar. Margaret looked up. A blonde woman, about 50 years old, was pointing at her with disdain. Her suit was cream-colored and probably cost more than Margaret's rent for an entire year. "The floor isn't perfect. I can tell you're not used to truly important work." The words were a slap. Margaret had cleaned that floor for 2 hours, kneeling until her knees bled through her pants. But she lowered her head and started over, because she needed that extra money, because her pride didn't pay rent. At 11, the bride arrived. Victoria Sterling entered like a queen, surrounded by an entourage of assistants who followed her like satellites around the sun. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her skin without a single imperfection, her blue eyes shining with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. But there was something in her gaze, something cold, calculating, that contrasted with the radiant smile she bestowed upon photographers and organizers. Margaret watched her from her corner, scrubbing the same tiles for the 3rd time, and felt an inexplicable chill. "Who is that woman?" asked Victoria, pointing directly at Margaret. "I don't want dirty people around when the cameras arrive." The organizer approached Margaret with an embarrassed expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, the bride prefers that you finish your work and leave. We'll pay you in full, but—" "I understand," Margaret murmured, gathering her supplies. But as she packed her rags in the plastic bucket, something caught her attention. Under the last pew, where no one would ever look, there was a manila envelope that someone had dropped. Margaret picked it up instinctively, intending to return it to some organizer. The envelope was open. Inside were photographs, documents, and something that made her heart stop completely. A letter. Handwritten, in handwriting she recognized as well as her own voice. Handwriting she had seen on shopping lists, on love notes stuck to the refrigerator, on the only goodbye letter she had never received. "My dearest Victoria," the letter began, "I know our story isn't conventional, but true love never is. Since you pretended to be someone else to meet me, I knew you were special. Your plan to hide your past was brilliant." Margaret kept reading with trembling hands. The letter spoke of elaborate lies, of a false identity, of forged documents. Victoria Sterling was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Isabel Martinez. She had been born in a poor neighborhood in another city, and her entire aristocratic past was an invention. But what shocked her most was the signature at the end. "With all my love, Alexander." Alexander. That name she hadn't spoken in years, that she had buried under layers of pain and forgetting. Could it be? Could there be more than one Alexander in the world? Or could fate be so cruel as to put her face to face with, "Hey, you!" Victoria's voice woke her from shock. The bride was 3 feet away, her eyes fixed on the envelope Margaret held in her hands. "That's not yours. Give it to me immediately." Margaret looked her in the eyes for the first time, and in that look she saw confirmation, fear, pure panic. Victoria knew exactly what was in that envelope, and she knew her castle of lies had just begun to crumble. "No," said Margaret, with a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "I don't think I'm going to do that." The temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. What more would those documents reveal? And how would Victoria react when she realized that her most dangerous secret had fallen into the wrong hands? The organ began to play at 4 o'clock sharp in the afternoon. The deep notes filled every corner of the cathedral like a golden tide, and 600 guests stood up in a collective whisper of silk and velvet. Margaret was hidden in the side confessional, with the manila envelope pressed against her chest like a shield. During the past 5 hours, she had read every document, every photograph, every line of that correspondence that destroyed the perfect image of Victoria Sterling. Isabel Martinez had been born in Hope Valley, the same neighborhood where Margaret had grown up. She had worked as a waitress, as a saleswoman. She had even had problems with the police for minor scams. One day, she had disappeared from her previous life and had reappeared 3 years later as Victoria Sterling, heiress to a textile fortune that had never existed. But the most shocking thing was in the last letters. Alexander's name appeared again and again, along with detailed plans on how to maintain the deception after marriage. There were references to our years in Mexico, to when you had to change your identity for me, to the business that made us rich but forced us to flee. Could it be the same Alexander? Her Alexander, the man who had disappeared one night without explanation. The wedding march began. Margaret peeked through the crack in the confessional and saw the pages scattering white petals over the marble she had polished that morning. Then came the bridesmaids, like a spring parade in lavender dresses. And finally, her. Victoria advanced on the arm of an older man who must be her adoptive father, radiant in a dress that seemed made of liquid light. Her smile was perfect, her posture impeccable, her interpretation of the happy bride role absolutely convincing. But Margaret could see what others couldn't see. The tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly searched for exits, the way her fingers clenched over the bouquet of roses. At the end of the aisle, waiting by the altar, was the groom. The world stopped when Margaret saw him clearly for the first time. He was older, of course. His brown hair was now silver at the temples. His face had acquired the lines of success and age. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's annual salary, and a self-confidence that the young Alexander she had known had never possessed. But they were the same gray eyes, the same way of tilting his head when he was nervous, the same small scar on his chin, a reminder of a bicycle fall when they were 18. It was him, Alexander Bennett, her husband, Emma's father, the man who had vanished from her life as if he had never existed. The priest began the ceremony with a solemn voice. The words about eternal love, fidelity until death do us part, sounded like a cosmic mockery in Margaret's ears. Every promise that Victoria and Alexander made to each other was a lie built on other lies. If anyone knows of any impediment why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The traditional phrase floated in the air like an invitation. Margaret felt her heart accelerate to the point of exploding. Her hands trembled around the envelope. Her whole body screamed at her to stay quiet, to remain invisible as she always had. But then she remembered Emma, her baby, who had died alone in a public hospital while her father lived a life of luxury with another woman. She remembered the nights crying, wondering what she had done wrong, why she hadn't been enough. She remembered 15 years of pain that had never had an explanation. Truth had a right to exist, even if it cost her everything. Margaret stood up. The movement was so abrupt that the confessional creaked. 600 pairs of eyes turned toward her like spotlights. The organ fell silent with a groan. The silence that followed was so deep that you could hear the collective heartbeat of the congregation. Victoria paled until she became translucent. Alexander frowned, as if trying to focus on a figure that seemed vaguely familiar to him. "Lies!" shouted Margaret, with a voice that came from the deepest part of her entrails. "That woman is not who she claims to be." The echo of her words bounced between the marble columns like sacred thunder. A murmur of shock ran through the guests like a wave. "How dare you!" shrieked Victoria, her mask of perfection finally cracking. "Security! Get this crazy woman out!" But Margaret was already walking down the center aisle, holding the envelope high like a battle flag. With each step she took, she felt the invisible woman she had been for years fade away, being replaced by someone stronger, braver, more true. "Her real name is Isabel Martinez," she shouted without stopping. "She has false documents. Her entire past is a lie." The guests erupted in murmurs of shock. The photographers' cameras began firing non-stop. Victoria screamed contradictory orders to a security team that didn't know whether to stop the intruder or protect the bride. Margaret reached the altar and planted herself 3 feet from the couple, breathing hard but firm. "I have proof!" she shouted, waving the envelope. "Letters, documents, photographs. This woman has been deceiving everyone." Alexander took a step forward, his gray eyes fixed on Margaret's face with an intensity that made her tremble. For the first time in 15 years, he was really looking at her. And then, with a voice she recognized from her deepest dreams, he whispered a single word that changed everything. "Margaret?" How would Alexander react upon recognizing the woman he had abandoned 15 years ago? And what would Victoria do when she realized that her past and present had just collided in the most devastating way possible? The name floated in the air like a confession. Margaret. Full, 2 syllables that contained 15 years of absence, of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights wondering what had happened to the woman who had once been the center of his universe. Alexander Bennett took a step toward her, and Margaret could see how recognition spread across his face like ripples in a pond. The years vanished between them. She was 23 again. He was 25, and they were in their small, newlywed apartment, planning a future that never came. "My God. It's you," he whispered, with a broken voice that made 600 people hold their breath. "It's really you." Margaret felt her legs turn to jelly. For years she had imagined this moment, had mentally rehearsed the words she would say to him if she ever found him. But now, faced with the reality of his gray eyes and familiar voice, she could only whisper, "Why?" One word that contained the entire universe of her pain. Victoria watched the scene with growing horror. Her perfect ceremony was turning into a real-time nightmare, And worse yet, she could see in Alexander's gaze something she had never seen before: true guilt, true pain, true love for another woman. "Alexander!" she shouted, trying to regain his attention. "Don't listen to this crazy woman. She's disturbed. She probably doesn't even really know you." But Alexander wasn't listening to her. He approached Margaret with slow steps, like someone approaching a mirage for fear it might disappear. "Margaret, I thought I'd never see you again. I thought you'd be better off without me." "Better?" Margaret's voice rose an octave, loaded with 15 years of contained fury. "Better? You left me pregnant and alone? Our daughter died, Alexander. She died!" The scream resonated in the cathedral like an ancestral lament. Several guests stifled exclamations of shock. The cameras kept firing, capturing every second of human drama in its rawest form. Alexander froze completely. His face decomposed entirely. What did you say?" "Emma," Margaret cried, and for the first time in years tears flowed freely down her cheeks. "Her name was Emma. She lived 3 years. She died of pneumonia in a county hospital because she had no health insurance, because I worked off the books, because I was completely alone." The world stopped. Alexander stepped back as if he had received a punch to the stomach. His face turned the color of ash. "No, I didn't know," he stammered. "Margaret, I didn't know you were pregnant. If I had known—" "Liar!" shouted Victoria from the altar, desperate to control the situation. "Of course you knew. You told me. You told me that's why you left." The silence that followed was absolute. 600 people simultaneously processed the magnitude of what Victoria had just revealed. Alexander turned to his bride with an expression of horror and terrible understanding. "What did you just say?" he asked, with a voice so low it was barely audible. Victoria realized her mistake too late. Her eyes widened in panic, but there was no going back. Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands and took out the letters. With a firm voice despite the tears, she began to read. "My dearest Victoria, thank you for helping me flee from Mexico after the problem with the investors. I know that faking our death in that plane crash was risky, but it was the only way to start over." She looked up at the guests. "This letter is dated 12 years ago." A murmur of shock ran through the congregation. Alexander looked at Victoria with a mixture of betrayal and terrible understanding. Margaret continued reading. "Isabel, love, I know that changing your identity for me was a sacrifice, but soon we'll have so much money we can be whoever we want to be. My only regret is knowing I left Margaret pregnant, but you're right. She would be better off not knowing the truth about the business that got us into trouble." The cathedral was so silent you could hear the beating of 600 hearts. Alexander staggered, leaning on the altar. He whispered, "You told me that Margaret had lost the baby. You told me she had moved away and never wanted to see me again. You told me." "I lied for your own good," Victoria shouted, finally admitting the truth. "That woman would have ruined you. She was poor, uneducated, without class. You deserve better." Margaret moved closer, holding another letter. "Here it says you knew where I lived, Alexander. That you had my address. That you knew Emma had been born. Victoria convinced you not to look for me by telling you that I had rebuilt my life. That I was happy. That I had another man." Alexander closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were full of tears. "My God, Margaret, I thought you hated me. I thought you'd be better off without a man who had had to flee the country for shady business. Victoria convinced me that the noble thing was to leave you in peace, let you be happy without me. Meanwhile, I was working 18 hours a day trying to pay for our daughter's medicine," Margaret shouted. "I was begging in county hospitals. They humiliated me in government offices asking for help. And you were building an empire with this. She couldn't finish the sentence. 15 years of pain hit her like an avalanche. Alexander approached her, completely ignoring Victoria, ignoring the guests, ignoring the cameras. "Margaret, forgive me. Please, if I had known the truth." I would never have left. Emma was my daughter. You were my life. Victoria, seeing that she was losing control completely, played her last card. She's lying. That woman is crazy. Those letters probably aren't even real. I hired her to clean this morning, and she's obviously obsessed with me. But Margaret had one last revelation. She took out of the envelope a wrinkled photograph. Emma as a baby, in Margaret's arms, with a dedication on the back written in Alexander's own hand. For my Princess Emma, with all of Daddy's love. May you always be happy. Alexander took the photograph with trembling hands. The date on the back was from 12 years ago. Victoria had had this photo all along. You, he said to Victoria with a voice loaded with fury that made the stained glass windows tremble. You knew I had a daughter. You knew she was alive, and you let me believe she had died before being born. Victoria's castle of lies crumbled completely. Her mask of perfection fell, revealing the desperate and calculating woman who had built her entire life on deception. I did it for love, she shouted. Everything I did was for our love. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of contempt and compassion that was more devastating than any scream. That wasn't love, Victoria. That was possession. And it cost my daughter her life. How would this confrontation end that had destroyed not only a wedding, but 15 years of carefully constructed lies? And what decision would Alexander make now that he knew the whole truth? The moment stretched like a rope about to break. Alexander held Emma's photograph against his chest, tears silently running down his cheeks. Margaret trembled from head to toe, exhausted by years of pain finally released. And Victoria looked around with the desperation of a cornered animal. 600 guests remained in absolute silence, witnesses to a drama that surpassed any soap opera. The photographers had stopped shooting, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Alexander slowly raised his gaze, like a man awakening from a 15-year nightmare. His gray eyes, now bright with tears, surveyed the cathedral, the perfect flowers, the elegant guests, the altar where he had been about to commit the biggest mistake of his life. This wedding is over, he said, with a voice that resonated in every corner of the sacred building. The murmur that followed was like the roar of a waterfall. Victoria clutched Alexander's arm with desperate force. You can't do this, she screamed. We have contracts, guests, business commitments, my reputation. Alexander freed himself from her grip with a firmness he had never used with her before. Your reputation is built on lies, Victoria. And mine. He looked at Margaret. Mine is stained by the worst betrayal a man can commit, abandoning the woman he loves and the daughter he never knew. He turned to the guests, with Emma's photograph still in his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice amplified without need of a microphone, I deeply regret having made you come here to witness my greatest error. This woman, he pointed to Margaret, is Margaret Sullivan. She was my wife for 5 years. She is the mother of my daughter Emma, who died 9 years ago while I lived a lie. The silence was deafening. Several high society ladies fanned themselves nervously. The gentlemen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman I was about to marry has lied to me for 12 years. She made me believe that my wife had lost our baby, that she had rebuilt her life, that she was happy without me. Meanwhile, Margaret was raising our daughter alone, working day and night to pay for medicine that I could have afforded with pocket change. Victoria tried to interrupt him, but Alexander raised his hand with authority. Emma Bennett Sullivan died at 3 years old from pneumonia that became complicated in a county hospital. She died without knowing her father. She died while her father built a fortune, thinking he was doing the right thing by staying away. Tears ran freely down the faces of several guests. Even the coldest members of the elite couldn't remain immune to such tragedy. Alexander approached Margaret, who remained motionless in the middle of the aisle, still holding the envelope with proof of 12 years of deception. Margaret, he said with a broken voice, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know there are no words that can repair the damage. But I need you to know that if I had known the truth, I would never have left. Never. Margaret looked at him with eyes that had cried so many tears, they seemed like dry wells. "And does that change anything?" she asked, with a voice so low only he could hear it. "Does that bring Emma back? Does that erase the nights I spent alone in the hospital, begging doctors I couldn't pay? Does that erase 15 years of wondering what I did wrong?" Alexander closed his eyes. When he opened them, he had made a decision. "No," he said. "It doesn't change anything about the past, but maybe it can change something about the future." He turned to the entire congregation with the determination of a man who had finally found his purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen, this cathedral is witness that something new is born today. Not a marriage based on lies, but a promise of reparation. I'm going to create a medical foundation in the name of Emma Bennett Sullivan. Every dollar I was going to spend on this wedding, every dollar I was going to spend on the honeymoon, will go to that foundation, so that no child dies from lack of medical resources like my daughter did." The murmur of approval ran through the guests like a wave. Several began to applaud until the sound filled the entire cathedral. Victoria, seeing that she had lost everything, played her final card of spite. "This is ridiculous," she screamed. "That woman is a cleaning lady, a nobody. You're Alexander Bennett. You can have any woman in the world." Alexander looked at her with a mixture of compassion and contempt that was more devastating than any scream. "Victoria, for 12 years you made me believe that money and status were the most important things. I was wrong. The most important thing is truth. And the truth is that this cleaning lady, as you call her, is more noble than all of us put together. She worked honestly to support our daughter. We built our wealth by running from our problems and lying to whoever was necessary." He approached Margaret once more, but this time not as the successful businessman he had been for years, but as the humble young man she had once loved. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to come back to me. I'm only asking you to let me honor Emma's memory. Let me try to be the father I should have been, even though it's too late." Margaret looked at him for long seconds. In her eyes, Alexander could see the process of a woman who had carried immense pain alone and who now had to decide if she was capable of turning that pain into something constructive. "Emma would have wanted you to help other children," she finally said. "She was always generous. Even when she barely had toys, she shared them with other children in the park." Alexander nodded, with more tears running down his cheeks. "Then we'll do that. In her name. In her memory." Victoria, finally defeated, ran out of the cathedral, with her wedding dress dragging across the marble like a fallen comet's tail. Her steps echoed until they disappeared completely. The guests began to leave in respectful silence. Some approached Alexander to express their support. Others approached Margaret to ask for forgiveness for having judged her before knowing her story. When the cathedral finally emptied, only Alexander and Margaret remained, standing in the same place where everything had begun that morning. "And now what?" asked Margaret. Alexander looked at Emma's photograph that he still held in his hand. "Now we learn to live with the truth. And if you allow me, we learn to honor our daughter's life together." Could Margaret find in her heart the strength to forgive 15 years of pain? And what would happen when the world knew the complete story of the cleaning lady who stopped the wedding of the century with nothing more than the truth? 3 years later, the Emma Bennett Sullivan Foundation occupied an entire building in the heart of the city, with glass walls that let in all possible light. In the front garden, a Japanese cherry tree bloomed every spring with pink flowers that fell like tears of joy onto the green grass. Margaret walked through the halls with the tranquility of someone who had finally found her place in the world. She was no longer invisible. The children who received free treatment at the foundation ran toward her shouting, "Aunt Maggie," with voices full of life and hope. The doctors consulted her on difficult cases, knowing that she understood better than anyone what it meant to fight for a child's life. She wore a simple sky-blue dress, her hair loose for the first time in years, and in her eyes shone something that had been absent for a long time. Peace. It wasn't happiness, exactly. Complete happiness had died with Emma, but it was something better. Purpose. Alexander worked from an office on the top floor, but came down every day to walk through the rooms, to meet each child, to make sure no one else went through what Emma had gone through. He had sold his most profitable companies, had liquidated properties, had converted his fortune into medicine, hope, and second chances. They didn't live together. Margaret had been clear from the beginning. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and love wasn't rebuilt with good intentions. But they worked together, honoring their daughter's memory in the only way that made sense. The story of the interrupted wedding had become legendary. The videos had circulated around the world. Margaret had received offers to write books, to give lectures, to appear on television programs. She had rejected everything. Her story wasn't a spectacle. It was a lesson about the price of lies and the power of truth. Victoria had disappeared completely. Some said she had fled to Europe with a new identity. Others that she had returned to Hope Valley with her tail between her legs. Margaret no longer cared. Some people chose to build their lives on lies. She had chosen to build hers on her daughter's memory. That Tuesday afternoon, like every October 15th, anniversary of Emma's death, Margaret headed to the garden. Under the Japanese cherry tree was a white marble plaque that simply said, Emma Bennett Sullivan, 2010-2013. Her light continues to shine in every life we save. Alexander was already there, kneeling by the plaque with a bouquet of white daisies, Emma's favorite flowers, according to what Margaret had told him. "Hello, princess," he whispered. "Daddy brought you flowers again. Today we saved a girl your age. Her name is Sophia. I think you would have liked to be her friend." Margaret approached silently and knelt beside him. They didn't speak for long minutes. It wasn't necessary. Shared pain doesn't need words. "Do you think she can see us?" Alexander finally asked. Margaret gently touched the marble plaque. "I think she sees us in every child who goes home healthy. I think she sees us in every mother who doesn't have to cry alone in a hospital. I think she sees us every time we choose truth over comfortable lies." They stood up together, looking at the building they had built with love and transformed pain. Through the windows, they could see children playing in the waiting rooms, parents hugging their children after receiving good news, doctors running to save lives. "Margaret," Alexander said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me that truth always finds its way. No matter how long it takes, no matter how much it hurts, truth always wins." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a complete smile. "It wasn't me who taught you that, Alexander. It was Emma. From the moment she was born, she taught me that true love doesn't lie, doesn't run, doesn't abandon. It just sometimes takes us time to understand the lesson." A gentle breeze made pink petals fall from the cherry tree, dancing around them like celestial confetti. In the air floated the aroma of flowers and the distant sound of children's laughter. Margaret looked up at the sky that was turning golden with sunset. "Truth hurts," she murmured, "but lies kill. And I don't want to live in a world where lies are more comfortable than truth." Alexander nodded, also looking up. Emma would have been proud of her mother, the woman who had the courage to shout the truth when no one else dared. The petals continued falling softly, like a pink blessing over two people who had learned that true love isn't perfect, but it's always honest. That justice doesn't always come quickly, but it always comes. And that sometimes the most powerful person in a room full of rich people is the one who has nothing to lose except their dignity. As they walked back to the building, Margaret stopped in front of the mural they had painted on the main wall. It was a representation of Emma. A girl with enormous eyes and a luminous smile, surrounded by other children of all ages and colors, playing under an infinite blue sky. "Do you know what's strangest about all this?" Margaret murmured, gently touching her daughter's painted face. "For years I thought my pain had no purpose, that Emma had died for nothing, that my suffering was useless." Alexander stood beside her, also observing the mural. "And now? Now I know that every tear I shed, every night I spent awake wondering why, every moment of despair, all of that prepared me for this moment, to understand other mothers' pain, to know exactly what words they need to hear, what hope they need to embrace." A group of children ran out of the building, laughing and chasing each other among the falling petals. Their voices filled the air with music that was pure life, pure recovered joy. "Look at that," Margaret smiled, pointing to the little ones. "Emma is there, in every smile, in every race, in every hug from a mother who doesn't have to cry alone. We didn't lose her, Alexander, we multiplied her." In her dress pocket, Margaret always carried the same wrinkled photograph she had shown in the cathedral 3 years earlier. She took it out and looked at it once more, but this time without tears. "Thank you, my love," she whispered to the image, "for teaching me that shared pain becomes healing, and that truth, although it hurts, is always the path to light." The sun completely disappeared behind the city buildings, but the warm lights from inside the foundation created a golden glow that extended to the garden. It was as if the building itself radiated hope. Alexander and Margaret entered together, not as reconciled spouses, but as two souls who had found their purpose in honoring a life that, although brief, had changed the world in ways they never could have imagined. Because in the end, truth doesn't need silk dresses or marble cathedrals. It only needs a brave voice that dares to speak, no matter who is listening. And when that voice finds its echo in other brave hearts, it can transform the deepest pain into the brightest hope. If this story reminded you that truth is always worth more than the comfort of lies, if it inspired you to be brave when life tests you, if it made you believe again in the power of justice, subscribe to our channel right now. Here you'll find more stories like this. Tales that heal deep wounds, that inspire fighting for what's right, that show you human goodness can always triumph over cruelty. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose truth. Leave a comment telling us what inspired you most about Margaret's story. And remember, in a world full of comfortable lies, being like Margaret, being honest, brave, and dignified, is the most powerful act of rebellion that exists. Give it a thumbs up if you believe truth always deserves to be defended, no matter the cost. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss any story that changes your perspective on life. See you in the next story of transformation and second chances.